Want to send your After Effects 3D track camera over to Unreal for animation and then bring it all back to After Effects for compositing? Me too. Let's do it. Unreal Engine is a powerful, free, real-time 3D creation tool. It should be an ideal application for After Effects artists who want to work with 3D, but there's really no established workflow for using these two software tools together. But in this video, I'm going to show you how to make it happen. We'll start with the simple round trip from After Effects to Unreal and back. And then we'll take on a more complex project with some real-world challenges. We'll look at 3D camera tracking, project setup, lighting, shadow passes, compositing, color grading, rendering, and more. Hey, don't forget to like and subscribe below, and make sure you download the project file so that you can follow along. Also, keep your hands and head in at all times, and buckle up, because we're going for a ride. Okay, since I know that so many people want the answer to the question, how do I get my 3D motion track camera from After Effects into Unreal? We're going to do a super simple project, and then we'll come back and do a more complex project that requires shadow maps, color grading, and more. But before we do anything, make sure to download this free tool called Normalized Track. If you're doing 3D camera tracking in After Effects, this is by far one of the most useful tools you will ever use because it helps make sense out of the track in terms of scale and orientation of your 3D track. If you've ever done a motion track and the scale of the project is crazy big or small, or it feels randomly oriented, this will fix that. And again, as you can see, just click through, and it's free. You can buy it for $0 and just download it and install it. Okay, so here I am in After Effects with a super basic shot that I filmed in slow motion in an alley not too far from my apartment. I shot it at dusk. There's a little bit of noise, but that's unimportant. And it actually gives us an advantage, which is that there are no harsh shadows or anything like that. Everything is really in shadow at this point, so we have a lot to work with here. Okay, so let's get tracking. I'm gonna select my layer right here, and then making sure that I have my tracker panel open right here, I'm gonna hit Track Camera. And it's going to start tracking immediately. Now this will take, maybe a minute or two. And when it's done tracking, it'll solve the track itself, and then it'll give us all the data points we need for our track and composite. So I'm just going to choose this spot, maybe right here, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose Create Solid in Camera, and that creates our solid, and it's actually oriented really well. The axes are just perfectly aligned the way that I would want them to. It rarely happens this way, but I'm glad it did. We've got an up, we've got down, left and right. It all looks kind of oriented the way I would want my 3D world to look. But if it wasn't, you could just grab hold of the gizmo here and arrange it the way you wanted to. And again, it's just about setting up your 3D world for success later in Unreal Engine. So I'm just going to reset that and maybe actually even just do it a little more like that. That looks really good to me. And then I'm going to rename this solid Floor. Next, we're going to work with Normalized Track, but I wanted to show you what we're going to be aiming for. So if I hit P for position and R for rotation, you can see that the orientation is all kinds of crazy and the position doesn't seem like it's anything that makes sense. And that's because After Effects really doesn't know what to make of our 3D world. But by using Normalized Track, we're going to fix that. So with my floor selected, I'll choose Window, Normalized Track, and again, it's really important that we have this layer named Floor because that's what Normalized Track is going to be looking for. I'm going to click on Normalized Track, and if we check our position now, it's 960 by 540, which is the center of our After Effects universe, because again, this is a 1920 by 1080 composition. And also the orientation makes a lot more sense. 270 rotated on the X and the rest are 0 and 0, and that's perfect. So with that done, now we've got something that's set up properly for Unreal. So how do we get this over to Unreal? And the secret is Cinema 4D, but not Cinema 4D the program, just some of the tools that have been set up to make it possible for After Effects to work with Cinema 4D. In fact, it's going to be After Effects' ability to export a Cinema 4D project file along with Cineware for Unreal. So let's take a look. If we go up to File and Export, we'll see that there's an option here called Maxon Cinema 4D Exporter. And I'm going to click on that. And when I do, I'm going to get an error message that tells me I have to save the project before exporting. So I'm going to choose File, Save As, and then I'll find a location to save it in. And we'll just call this Alley Track. And then we'll hit Save. Then we're going to go with File, Export, Maxon Cinema 4D Exporter, and it's going to tell me that there's some 2D layers found in here and it won't be saving those along with it, and that's fine. We click OK. And I'll leave the name Ali Slow-Mo and I'll save it. And we're ready for Unreal Engine, but we do need to do a little bit of setup for that. Now, the first thing we need to do is to download and install Cineware for Unreal Engine. And so we head over to the Unreal Marketplace and we type in Cineware, and Cineware by Maxon comes up. And if we click on this button, it takes us to another website, which is Maxon's website. Click on that, and it brings us to the website. And then you choose whether or not you want to install for Windows or for Mac. I'll just grab for Windows in my case. And it tells me that I've got to sign in. If you don't have an account, you can register. It's free, as is Cineware. So I'm just going to personally sign in. And then I may need to kind of go back to that page. And once I do that, I'm going to download again. I can choose which version I want. I'm going to take Cineware 2025 for Unreal Engine 5.4. And I'll click download and let it go. Once you get it, run the installer and set it up. Okay, so we're going to start up Unreal. We're going to go to our film, video, and live events template. We're going to choose blank and choose a location where you want to save your project. I'm going to turn on ray tracing, and I'm going to name my project AE to UE. And I'm going to click create. And once the project has started up, we've got to do some setup. So let's do that. If you check out the files that you've downloaded to go along with this tutorial, you'll find that there's an Unreal Assets folder, and within that there's a content folder, and you can just go into the content folder and you can grab artwork and materials. This has got the logo we're going to work with right now, and some materials are going to be important to help us save a bunch of time. And then in here, in the actual project that we just created, go over to content right here, and then I'm just going to choose copy over here, and I'm just going to paste it right here. And if we look inside of our project, we can see that in the content folder, we've got artwork and we've got materials. And again, we've just got this logo for School of Motion. And in materials, we've got different kinds of materials that will help us. Okay, the next thing we need to do is change some settings and then set up some plugins. So let's go into the settings, choose Edit, and we'll go to Project Settings. And we're going to type in Alpha Channel. And we're going to set up Enable Alpha Channel Support and Post-Processing through Tone Mapper. This is going to help us get transparency and also use it for shadow mapping later. Then I want to type in Ray Trace, and I want to just turn on Ray Trace Shadows. You don't have to. I find that it looks nicer. And then we're going to go into the plugin settings. By the way, you may get a warning there that says we need to restart. Don't do that yet, because again, we're going to jump into these plugins now. So Edit, Plugins, and we're going to look for Motion Design, and you can see we got the motion design tools here. We're going to turn that on, and it says it's experimental. Don't worry about it. Click yes. Don't restart yet. We've got more to do. But just so you know, we're going to be using a couple of the motion design tools to help us in our work here. Next, type in Cineware. And it may already be on, but if it's not, turn it on. Then if this is the first time you've ever used Unreal, then you might need to set this up. But let's type in Movie Render, and we'll see the movie render queue. I've got that turned on. You're going to want to turn that on. And for something that we're going to do later, you're going to want to have on the render passes. So turn that on as well. And again, it's experimental. Click yes. And then just hit restart now. Okay, once our project has restarted, we are ready to rock and roll. Choose File, New Level. We'll go with an empty level right here. Click Create. And then within that, we're going to click on this button right here. That's for the quickly add to project. And we're going to choose Datasmith, File Import, and we're going to choose Ali Slow-Mo, our Cinema 4D project file. You'll have to navigate to wherever you save that from After Effects and click on Open. And then it wants to know where we want to put this file. I'm going to create a new folder in the content folder called AE Projects. And I'll click OK. And then I'll click OK. And from here, we got options for importing. Just click on Import. And Cineware initializes. And then it wants to know which aspects of the After Effects project we want to bring in. The 3D tracker camera is a must. It's already selected. And we only need the floor. So I'm going to click OK. And as you can see, it brings that in. You might not see anything. If you're set to lit, you won't see anything, but I'm set to unlit right now just so that I can see this, because the project file, we don't have any lights in here, right? So we've got to add lights and set that all up. But for now, I just want to take a look at this. So I'm going to go over to the motion design tools right here. I'm going to click to add them in, which creates a sequencer automatically. And then I'm going to go to the content browser, and in this Ali Slow-Mo folder, there's an animations folder. Hop into that and grab this Ali Slow-Mo right here. and drag this into the sequencer and just drop it right here. Now, a couple of things that I noticed. There's a warning sign here, and that's because the frame rate is off. We were at 24 frames per second in After Effects, so let me switch that over to 24 frames per second. And then also the last frame, I want to get to that last frame. If we open up our After Effects project right here, we can see that the last frame, because we're here right now, is frame number 364. So I'm going to come over to here, and I'm going to type in 364. And then I'm going to set that to be the end frame. Then if I come over to my view here and I select the 3D tracker camera and I do a quick check this out. We've got our camera animation. Woohoo! Now at this point, it's always a good idea to save your work. So just come over to here and choose Save All. You'll get the option to save everything we brought in and all this stuff. I'm just going to hit Save Selected. We have to name our scene here. So I'll call the level Alley Slow-Mo Level, and click on Save. Okay, now I want to bring in a backplate so that I can match up my animation with the footage. So to do that, I'm going to come over here to Actors, and I'm going to choose Media Plate, and I'll just click on this twice. And you can see it creates a media plate. Let me get into my outliner here. And the media plate right now, we can't see it. Let me just reset its position so it's at 0. And if I were to rotate this, for example, you can see that it's black and it's a square, and that's because there's no footage loaded in it right now. So I'm going to scroll down here and you'll see that there's this place where we have the option of loading a file, right? You can choose an asset that's already in the project. In this case, I'm just going to load an external file. I'm going to click on this right here, and I will choose the Alley Slow-Mo original footage that we have that we used in After Effects to track, and I'm going to click on Open. And right now I don't see anything, but if we come back up here and we click on this button right here, Open the Current Media, you'll see that it actually starts to play. It's really small there, but it starts to play. And also, what's cool about it is it's actually fixed the resolution, whereas it was a square before, now it's 16 by 9. Now the next thing I want to do is drop this into the sequencer. So I'm going to take the media plate, drop it right here, and it asks me if I want to disable autoplay on the media plate actor, and I'm going to say yes, because what this allows to happen is that the sequencer will decide when the video plays, right? So now, if I hit play, you can see that the footage is playing. It's hard to see there, but it is playing there. And what I want to do is, with this footage selected, I want to choose this button right here, Align Actors, and click on this, which stretches it to fill the screen. Now, I realize I probably should have moved that back in 3D space. Let me undo that and try one more time. I'm going to hit W to move it. I'm going to send this back really far in 3D space, and I can make it even further. Let's just get it back really far to the negatives. And once I've done that, now this is very far in the background, so anything I animate in front won't be blocked by this media plate. So again, this time I'm going to hit this button right here, and it fills the screen. And what I want to do is take this media plate and drop it inside the 3D camera. So now wherever the camera moves, the media plate moves with it. So it will appear to always stay stable. It's actually moving along with the camera as the camera moves in 3D space. So basically what we've got is a flat plane playing video, and it's locked to the camera, so that as the camera moves, the plane moves. Now, it's set away at a distance and a scale that it 100% fills the camera's field of view. If I were to move this back further, then basically what we have to do is scale this up larger so that it takes up more of the camera's field of view and then eventually fills it. So the further back it goes, the bigger this plane playing the video, which is our media plate, has to be to fill the camera's view. Now let's go from the unlit mode to the lit mode. And when we do that, we're going to see that everything gets darker. And I'm just going to add in just a basic piece of geometry. Let's go with shapes here. I'll add in a sphere, and I'll just leave it there. So it's going to help us to see things a little better. Now, there's a lot of things happening here. First of all, I found that the flat planes that come in from After Effects, I don't know what it is, whether it's the materials or what. I haven't been able to figure it out, but they come in and they're either black or crazy overexposed. Now, we've got a problem here, which is we have no light, and also the camera you're going to see is completely underexposed. So let's add in a light first. We're going to go with lights here, and once we're in there, we choose skylight. And I'm going to look here, and instead of source type being SLS captured scene, I'm going to change this to SLS specified cube map. And from there, we can choose a different cube map to use. Right now, there's nothing, but Unreal comes with a bunch, and you can also load in your own. But I'm going to go with this one called Circus Maximus, which, if I click on it, it's kind of similar. We've got like a, concrete sort of ground and sky that's blue. And, all right, I'm going to close this out. And then I'm going to raise the intensity scale to, let's say if I raise it to 10, what happens? We're not even seeing anything. Let me bring it back down to 2. And the other problem is that the camera that comes in from After Effects for some reason is terribly unexposed. So let's go down to the exposure settings here. And you can find that under Lens, and then there's Exposure. And if you twirl that down, you'll see the metering mode is set to manual. I'm going to set that to auto exposure histogram. And now we've got this lit. But as you can see, this flat plane does not show anything. I don't really know what's happening there, but this is good. This gives us an idea of what the lighting looks like. And we're going to just use this floor to help us position what we do next. But I wanted this to see the light. So I don't need this sphere anymore, but just so you can see, if I were to raise the skylight intensity here, if we raise it to 10, it gets crazy bright. If we bring it down to 1, it's darker, 0.5, right? Gives a little bit of ambient light, but I'm going to leave it maybe at 1 or 2. Let's go with 2 for now, and then we can kind of decide as we go. I'm going to delete this sphere. I don't need this. And another potential problem that I want to stop before it becomes an issue is showing you that this backplate, even though it is an unlit material, meaning that it just is, not affected by light, it is, however, affected by exposure. So if we really crank up the exposure on this camera, then we're going to start seeing it get affected. And we don't want that, because as we're kind of tuning in the shading and the light for our object, we want to make sure that this does not get affected. And so what we've got here is a material that I've put inside of the folders here. So if you go to the materials folder, you'll see that there's a media plate exposure folder. And within that, there's a media plate exposure instance. And this is basically a media plate material. Come to the master material, take a quick look. And so basically what we've done here is, originally it was just a media texture that's going into the emissive and the opacity. And we've added in a pre-exposure. And by doing this, that will keep it from changing its brightness based on the exposure. And so I'm just going to take this right here, this one that's called the instance, and I'm going to drop it onto this media plate. So come down here, come to the material, bring it down over here. And now as we come back to the exposure from the camera, so let's come back to this right here, 3D tracker camera, and then play with the exposure, bring it up. It always snaps back to the exposure that it should be. Special thanks to, I want to say, Bjark Agard, who helped me out by explaining how to set this up, and I really appreciate it. Okay, now that the lighting and the background are set up properly, let's add in a logo. So I'm going to head over to this area right here. I'm going to choose the motion design mode, and I'm going to grab hold of this actor called SVG Actor. Just by clicking on the second time, it will drop it into the project. Switch back to the selection mode, and with my SVG selected, I'm going to rotate it. And then I'm going to change this from the SVG that you see right here. If I head into my content browser, where I've got these folders, one of the ones we brought in was an artwork folder, and that has the School of Motion logo. So I'm going to take that, I'm just going to drop it right there. And it's really small, so we can come down here and we can scale this up. I'm going to say to 10 for now, and then I'm just going to move it over right here. Now, it doesn't appear to be affected by any of the lighting. And that's because if I come down a little further, you'll see that it's set to SVG is unlit. So if I uncheck this, now it's being affected by the lighting. And it's darker than I want it to be, and there's a couple of reasons. One is the angle of the light, maybe, but also if we come back to our skylight, and this is a really important tip, by default, that skylight, if you go into the advanced settings right here, you'll find that by default, it's set to lower hemisphere is a solid color, which is black, and I don't want that. If I uncheck this, it's going to use the color from the map that we used, that 360-degree map, which had the concrete color for the ground, and that's reflecting much better as we look at it. You may also want to grab hold of the angle of this light that's here and maybe change the source cube angle. You can try that and see if it affects it in a way that you like. So maybe you want this front to be brighter, or maybe you want the back to be brighter and the front to be less lit. So either way, I think I'm going to leave this at 0 where it was. And let's just do quick playback. And, I can see that something's not right with the positioning here. So the other thing is this, is that if you notice looking at the objects that are in the scene, the camera is the child of this null, and this is a child of this null, or actors as we call them here in Unreal, but in After Effects they'd be nulls. And that means the position that's coming from this camera is being affected by this. And basically, there's a world existing inside of our main comp that's got a different coordinate system. So what I want to do is I want to take this and I want to drop it into this world. And in fact, just to make it match the floor even better, I'm going to make it the child of the floor. So drop that in, and then I'm going to reset the position, which makes it rest on the floor. In fact, it's resting through it because the middle of the SVG is right in the middle there, so it comes through the floor. And then I'm also going to reset the rotation, which is not going to give us the right rotation, but it will set it up so that at 90-degree changes, it's going to look much better. So now I'm just going to take this, drop it down like this, 90 degrees, and then rotate it like this, 90 degrees. And then I'll just move it and reposition it. So bring it back up, bring it over here. Probably want to make this bigger. So we'll change the scale, coming down to right here scale. We'll set this to 20. Maybe even 30. Let's see what that looks like. That's pretty big, but I mean, it gets the job done right here. Okay, cool. So we've got this, and if we play back the camera motion, what we can see is that it matches. Now, you may notice that the playback, there's like a slight variance in it where it seems to shift and it's just not matched up perfectly. And I've noticed this happen when I brought stuff in from After Effects, that the floor is slipping ever so slightly. It's not going to happen in After Effects, but I noticed that there's like sort of an extra frame that shouldn't be there. And I don't know why this happens. And I found a lot of the time that if I shift this back one frame, right, so that now it starts a frame early. If we come back here at the end, you can see that now it starts a frame early. I've found that that still seems to solve the problem, at least of previewing. So taking a look here, that looks much better. Let me get rid of this floor. And I'm just going to select the floor, and I'm going to type in visible. And I'm just going to turn off visibility because we don't want that. And, you know, we might want to add shadows to the ground, but I'm going to do that a little later in another example. This, I want to keep this simple, and we're going to add like a really simple shadow that we fake in After Effects, which works great. Now, if I want to extrude this logo a little bit here, I can just come down to where it says Fills Extrude, and I can set this to something like, let's say we set it to 3. That's pretty big, so maybe 2, maybe even 1.5. That's okay, you know, you can raise that or lower it as needed. We'll keep it just there like that. Perfect. Okay, so now that we've got this going, again, one more time, just a quick preview, and it's floating there. Okay, now, before we render this out, I just need to make this background plate invisible. So in my outliner, I'm going to select my media plate, and I'm just going to type in, again, visible, and we're just going to turn it off. And so all that we have now is this animation of the logo. So I'm pretty much ready to render out, but I have to make sure that I add the camera into the sequencer so that it can create a camera cut track. That way it renders what the camera sees. And once I've done that, let me just click right here, and our render settings come up. I'm going to just make a quick change. I'm going to turn off JPEG. I'm going to add in PNG sequence, and you can see that it says right alpha. I'll click accept, and I'm just going to hit render local, and it's going to render to this directory, and we'll just hit render. And as you can see, that's rendering pretty quick. Now, the thing is, you might not be able to see it here, but there is aliasing. And what you'll see is that when you render it straight out without blending frames, then you end up with something that looks a bit more aliased. So I'm just going to double click to open this folder. And you can see that white background means that it's on a transparent. But if I open it up, you know, you can see that it's pretty gross on the edges. So we got that with transparency, and that's great if you don't mind the level of quality that's here, and I do. So what we have to do is instead render out as an EXR, and let me show you why. So basically, if I'm going to add in anti-aliasing, so I'm going to come back over here, and let's say we go anti-aliasing right here, and we say we want to have 32 frames rendered for each frame and then blended so it's nice and clean. The problem is to do that, it loses its alpha channel. So I set it to 32. I'm going to have to override anti-aliasing. And because of that, now we've lost our alpha. So to get around that, I'm not going to do a PNG, and instead, I'm going to choose an EXR. So come down over to here, EXR sequence. And I'm also going to add in one other thing. Click on settings, and you'll see down here it has object IDs. And that's basically going to create for every single object, for each one of these little things, it's going to create its own ID, and we're going to be able to use that in After Effects to create transparency. So that's done. Let me click on Accept, and let's render. And this will take a little longer than the last one. You can see it's going a bit slower. And once that's done, if you want to know where the images are located, just click on this output folder right here, and that brings it up, and you can just copy this information so that when you open up After Effects and you need to import this, you'll have the directory ready to go that you can paste into the Explorer. And back in After Effects, let's import our footage. Right click, import, and we'll just grab the EXR sequence, click import, and if I drop that into the composition, well, it's on a black background, as I said it would be. So what we have to do is use the crypto matte effect. So with the layer selected, I'll choose Effect, I'll go to 3D Channel, and I'll choose Crypto Matte. And you can see that each of these objects have their own color, so that's their ID. And we can just click on this and hold down Shift to add more. If accidentally you select the background, for example, you hit Control, and it creates the scissor to get rid of it. So I'm just going to quickly select each of these, and I wish there were a way to just select everything and make it super easy, or drag and then just deselect the background, but it's not. So we're almost there, getting this done. And now we change it from the output of colors, we'll change it to matted RGBA. And look at that. So now it's got an alpha channel. I'm going to turn off the floor, and if we do a quick RAM preview, you can see that we've got some good motion. It's matching the camera. Everything looks good there, but it doesn't have a shadow. So let's just quickly add in like a really simple, easy shadow. And to do that, I'm just going to create a new solid. So I'll just actually duplicate this one. So hit Control D to duplicate it. Turn off the original. I'll set that to Layer, Solid Settings, and we're going to make it black. And click on New. And I'm just going to scale it out a bit, like that. And then I'm going to add in some masks. So I'll just grab hold of the rectangular mask tool and double click on it actually to create the first mask. Then double click that. We'll just shrink this down a little bit like this. And we'll just get this to be smaller like that, because we're going to be doing 2 of these. And let me hit F for feathering. And we'll lower the opacity overall to something like 40%. So it's just barely there. I think I need to expand the mask slightly on this side, just a little bit. And then I'm just going to duplicate the mask. So hit M reveals it. I'm going to hit Control D. I'm going to take this second mask, drag it under School of Motion like that. Drag this out slightly. I'll even let this overlap just a little bit there, which should be good. And if we do a quick RAM preview now, that's pretty good. Probably want to adjust that shadow just a little bit more and do this just a little bit better. And let's do it one more time. That's looking pretty solid. And if you wanted to add in something touching the ground like this metal barrel, you know, I kind of fake this shadow a little bit with another mask like this where it's under the ground and it's feathered, and just get a little bit of contact shadow again, because there's not a big shadow in this shot, so it wouldn't make sense to have a long shadow. I mean, add this, hey, why not just add a big friendly robot? Because, you know, you can. That's what I would do. But of course, these kinds of shadows aren't really going to be appropriate for many kinds of shots. Any shot that has light source that's casting a real shadow that's got any kind of length to it, this isn't going to work. And, you know, I shot this at dusk and that's fine. But in most scenarios, you're going to need to be able to create shadows and then composite those in as well. So we're going to look at that now. Hey, before we go any further, this is a great moment to mention that if you want to learn or improve your skills in After Effects, at School of Motion, we've got you covered. From beginner courses like After Effects Kickstart to more advanced classes like Animation Bootcamp and Expression Session, there's always more to learn. And if you want to learn Unreal from the ground up, check out Unreal Engine for 3D Artists with Jonathan Winbush. I took the class myself, and within just a few hours, I was up and running and making cool stuff in Unreal. Okay, let's get back to it. So here I am in After Effects with some footage that's going to be more challenging than what we worked with just before. There's long shadows here, which means anything that we drop into the scene is going to have long shadows too. And as things go into the distance, there's a haze, which means that colors are going to change in the distance if we want it to look right. But there's also a lot of opportunity for some cool stuff. I'm going to put stuff in the background. I'll probably put a couple of statues here in the foreground, and we'll kind of go from there and see how it works. It's worth noting that I got this footage on a website called dronestock.com. It's royalty free. and you can download the stuff and use it in your work or whatever. And there's a pretty good variety of stuff that was shot on a drone. The footage is free and it's CC0, so it's really just open to work with however you'd like. So thank you, Drone Stock. So I'm just going to run this through a track the same way we've done before, and I'll jump ahead to when it's done. Okay, so I've got myself what I would say is a good 3D track here, and I can work with this. And something I want to mention is that there is a little bit of distortion in this footage. I don't think it's going to cause us a problem in terms of the composite I'm trying to do, but often when you're working with drone footage or, maybe a GoPro camera, they're using a wide angle lens. And so in this case, you can see the horizon. It seems like it's fairly curvy there. And so if I wanted to, I could go in and use a tool like Red Giant Lens Distortion Matcher, which is part of the VFX suite from Red Giant, and use that to fix it. So let me just give you an example of this. So I'm going to go to Effect, RG VFX, and Lens Distortion Matcher, and I'm just going to set this to fisheye lens because I believe that's what it is, and I'm going to just find where I think this should be a straight line but isn't, right? This horizon feels like it should be, that's good enough, I think, should be a straight line, but it's, of course, there's bend in there. So if I remove the distortion, I might not have nailed that just right, but if we look at the bus, for example, look what happens to the bus as I turn this on and off, right? So the bus goes from being curved, there's a slight curve there, to being more of a straight line. Again, I think I overdid it here a little bit, so we'd have to work with it to get it just right, but if you run into this problem of distortions and you're planning to do compositing, you're really going to need to undistort it first and then track it and then maybe even export this footage over to your 3D program, because what happens here is that as objects reach the edge of the screen where the biggest amount of distortion is happening, they're going to slip because they no longer match what's on the screen. Anyway, we don't need it here, but I wanted you to be aware of that tool. Okay, so I've done a lot of tracking points here. I think that this is probably overkill, but I've named a bunch of them different things so that I have what I need to mark my spots in Unreal. And of course, I have to just take everything, all of these solids, and I just need to run normalize track, and I do that. And then we're going to just do what we did before, which is to export, and then we'll go over to Unreal. So I'll go to File, Export, Maxon Cinema 4D Exporter, and you know the deal. So back in Unreal, where we previously were working, I'll just create a new level. And again, just like before, we'll make sure that it's an empty level. I'll click Create. I'm going to import, just like we did before, Datasmith, and I'm going to grab this one called Bus Track, and I'll click Open. Make sure it drops it into the AE projects. Same old, same old. And it's going to ask me what I want to bring in. I'm going to select all, but then I'm going to deselect the thing at the top here. And I also don't need the original base. It's best not to bring this in at this top thing, because then it all comes as in one object. It's really hard to work with. But if we keep it as just these individual parts, and the 3D tracker camera comes in already, and then click OK, things should work fine. Okay, so everything has been brought in, and now I want to go over to my motion design tools and get that going. And then I'm going to go into the content browser, go into the animations, grab this one called Bus Track. I'm going to drop that onto the sequencer. And a couple of things. I know that the footage I was working with was 60 frames per second. Let's just look in After Effects, double check this. So it's 60 frames per second right here, and also the last frame is 979. So let's change this to 60 frames per second, and then let's jump to frame 979 and set that as the last frame. Then let's quickly switch over to the camera view and hit play and see what happens. And this is all looking pretty good. All right. Okay, now let's add in our backplate. I'll head over to Actors, and I'll just drop in the media plate like I did before. We can see it right here. I'm going to load up some footage, so let me grab that. Same stuff we were using in After Effects with the bus. And I'll just hit the open media player there. That'll play it. And okay, cool. Then I'm going to make this the child. Let me go back into my outliner. I'm going to make this media plate the child of this 3D tracker camera. I'm going to reset the position and rotation, and then I'm just going to move it back in 3D space. Something like, let's go with 25,000 back there. And then I'm going to try to use this tool right here that makes it centered and fill the screen, but it's not working. And I'd love to tell you I know why, but that happens sometimes. And best thing I can tell you is it sucks, but what we're going to do is we're just going to scale it manually. So let's head over to its scale right here. And I'm going to set this up to 300 and see what that looks like. Actually filled it up more than we needed it. So now I'm just going to dial it back until it's smaller. Let's get it to like 250. Looks like we're going to have to play that game. 275 until we can get it just right. So there it is. It may not be perfect, but it's going to be good enough to help us kind of get an idea how things are going. And I'm just going to take this media plate, drop it here in the timeline, and I'm going to follow the warning. I'm going to say, yes, it's fine. And let's just play this back now. And that's looking pretty good. Okay, and I saw some slipping at the end, and I wonder, let's just kind of zoom in here at the end here. It looks like there's a frame that's off again, just like we had before. So let's try it one more time. And that's looking pretty good. Okay, now let's add in some 3D objects, right? So I'm just going to go head over to Quixel Bridge. I'm going to grab some free stuff there. And I'm going to go to 3D Assets. I'll go to Historical. I'm going to go to Feudal Japan, Gravestones, and I'll grab this, which is already downloaded. Let me just, you can download it. I'm going to add it into my project. And then I'll take this gravestone object, and I'm just going to drop it here into the project. And then I'm going to make that the child of the distance 2 solid, just so I can get its rotation location. So doing that, and let me just quickly rotate it, scale it up. Actually, let me get this nice and big, set it to something like 10. Then I'll just bring that up like that, 90 degrees. And I'm going to make this really big, something like 25. And I'm going to send this very far back into the distance. And what's happened is I've moved it back really far, but I can no longer see it. And that's because I didn't anticipate how far back I would need to go. So I've got to actually move our media plate back even further. So I'm going to set this to 35,000, maybe even go to 40,000 back there. Let me just go to our sequencer so I can bring this up again. And I'm going to scale this up to 350. And it's got to be more, maybe 450. Okay. And if we play back, we've got that. And these objects are in the background. This is back there. I can probably even move this further back. And I'm going to scale it up even more. And now I've got that object in the distance. So I've played around with it a little bit more to get things exactly the way I want it. I moved the media plate backwards. I scaled this up, moved it a little further back. But anyway, I finally got to a place where I like this, and I'm going to now just duplicate this and set up the rest of this stuff in the background. And I'm not going to make you sit through that, so let's jump ahead. Okay, so I've set up some props you can see here, some stuff in the background. There's some statues. I've set it all up. I actually also set up some lighting, basic lighting like we did before with the skylight, but I haven't added in a directional light yet or shadow catchers, and we definitely have to do some organization of this stuff so that it'll be easier to render and composite later. So first, let's create the shadow catchers. Unreal doesn't have any great solution for this, but we're going to piece together something with the help of a tutorial that I've seen elsewhere and that I will show a link in the bottom, but I've tried to make it easy by skipping a couple of steps and giving you a material that will do a lot of the job for you. So the first thing we need to do is just add flat planes underneath any objects which we want to have a shadow. Now, these objects in the background, I don't think they need them. We're going to blend them into the background much better than they are right now, and I think the shadows are just going to be distracting. Whereas if we put this here for these two statues and maybe this little fence that we put in front of the bus, that's going to be necessary for the composite. So let me add in a flat plane. So we'll click on this button right here, and we'll go to Shapes, and we'll add in a plane. And then I'm going to take this plane, and I'm going to make it the child of each of these statues. So let's go and see. We've got this Japanese right here, the statue right here, this Japanese Komenu. Not sure. We're going to hit reset on its location and its rotation, and then we're going to scale it up to there like that. And then we're going to do the same for this one, which is that one right there. So let me just duplicate the plane and drop it into this statue. Again, reset, reset, and scale it down and just move it off to the side because I'm thinking about where the shadow is going to be based on what I saw on the bus, and that's what we want to have. Okay, lastly, we want to just add one into right here for this by the bus. So I'll just, again, duplicate the plane. And I'm going to grab this and I'm going to move it underneath the horse hitching post, which is I'm using as a fence. And I'm going to reset the location there, reset the scale too, and then I'll just scale this to whatever I think makes sense for now. And just set it up. Now we'll have to look at how this looks when we're done and how it all plays together, but I think we'll be able to make this work. So now let's add in our directional light, which will be casting the shadow. So I'm just going to move back to the first frame, rather to the end right here where I can see these objects. And I'm going to choose right here to add things, go to the lights, and go to directional light. And what I need to do is just rotate it until I can see a shadow. So let's just set this to world transform for the moment. And there we go. Now we've got shadows. And I think, well, what we're going to need to do is turn off the skylight for a moment so we can really see these shadows. In fact, we're going to use, when we render out the shadows, we're going to turn off the skylight altogether. So now we've got something that's starting to look kind of like that. It feels like it's matching the setup of this bus like a little bit. It's maybe a little too far, so I might want to rotate this light a little bit again, just kind of just get it. And also what I have to do is come back here and I can grab hold of it, and I notice that, you know, the angle seems to be not long enough. Basically the light isn't being cast long enough, so we've got to just get this light set up so that it's, yeah, like that. And come back here. That's looking better. And I still think we have to just change the angle slightly. Okay, let's come back to the bus here. And over to here. I think that's pretty good. Now let's just finesse the look of the lights. I'm going to turn the skylight back on. And it's really just the lighting for the object. I want to make sure it looks good. Probably I've got the light on too strong for the skylight. So let's come back down here. What's it set to 2? Let me come back and see if I can lower that at least a little bit. Maybe set that to 1. And I think that looks really good. Maybe a little overexposed though, so I can just go over to the camera here and I can change the exposure. So just type in exposure to make it just get quickly. And right now it's compensating by 1. I think we can bring it down to 0. That's looking a lot better to me. And I can take a look at this in path tracing, because the thing is, if I really want the most realistic render out of Unreal, the path tracer is going to be my best bet. It is a lot slower, but it can often be really worth it for a good render. So switching over to the path tracer, I can see this stuff is looking pretty good, and we can play it like this. It takes longer to render, so you get like the sort of kind of like noisy render while it's previewing. But that's looking really good. And the shadows we're not going to render through the path tracer, but this we're going to render out. These objects we're going to render with the path tracer. Worst case, if we find that it's still a little too exposed when we bring it into composite, we can always render at a lower exposure. So now is as good time as any to save our work, file, save all, and also to get a little more organized here. This is out of control. So coming into the outliner, and I'm going to create a new folder. Let me just do that here, create folder, and we're going to call this one 3D models. And I'm just going to take all of this stuff. Remember, these were children of these solids, but they don't need to be anymore. We were just using that to get it rotated and scaled properly and all of that. So I'm going to take all of these and I'm going to move them into this 3D model folder. I'm also going to take this horse hitching post, drop that, and these Japanese statues. I'm going to move them as well. Now the planes came with them, and that's fine. I also want to create a folder for all of the solids that came from After Effects. We'll call those solids, and I'm just going to grab hold of all of them. We've got from like, I think it's all of these down to here. I'm going to drop these in solids. And if I play back, everything still seems to be moving the way they should, so everything looks good there. And now what I'd like to do is create some layers. And you may not have the layer window available, but it's right here. You can choose window and just click on layers. And basically what we can do is we can take objects. So let me just come back to my outliner for a moment. We're going to go into our 3D models. and we're going to select everything, but we do not want the planes in this, right? So make sure we don't grab the planes. And I can see that the horse hitching post. Good. So we've got that. And we can go over to layers and we can right click and choose add selected actors to new layer. And then we're going to call this layer 3D models. And then we're going to come back to the outliner and we're going to grab the planes, each of these, and come back to the layers window and right click and choose add selected actors to new layer. We're going to call those shadow catchers. We're also going to add the directional light and the skylight to this 3D model layer. And the reason we're doing that is because when we render out these lion statues and these pillars in the background, we're going to need both lights on them. But then we're also going to render out just the shadow catchers. And for that, we only want the directional light. So I'm going to come back to the outliner and I'm going to select the directional light and come back to layers, or I can even probably just drag this. If I go into the layers window, I can probably just drag this right into the shadow catchers. Now there is a way to render actually just by layers, and it's really cool because basically imagine you had a bunch of objects you wanted to render in one pass, another bunch of objects in another pass. The problem is that when it comes to shadow catching, it's not going to work. And you can see that by, if I disable this layer, the 3D models, the shadows disappear. So if I was just to render the shadow catcher layer and not the 3D model layer, it falls apart. And there is actually a solution to make these shadows stay put even when the objects aren't there, but it does not work with layers. I organize things into layers just so it'd be easy to select the object. So for example, I can go over to this 3D model folder right here, and I can either select all the geometry through this button or the different kinds of lights, or I can go in and see the contents and I can easily select it. And so basically, without having to go to the outliner and find each of these objects, now they're on this layer, so it's easy for me to select. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these statues right here and also this little horse object right here, the horse hitching post. And I'm going to check hidden shadows. And when I check this, if I also set these objects to be invisible, watch what happens. Their shadows are still there. So basically these objects, even though they're no longer visible, they're still casting the shadow onto the shadow catcher. And again, I didn't have to organize these into layers to do it, but once you start adding lots and lots of 3D objects and each of them have shadows, it becomes so hard to select each one and then go to the make it visible and then make it a hidden shadow type of thing. So having them on a layer solves this problem, makes it much easier to keep organized. Another tip that may save you a lot of trouble is if you've got a lot of shadow catchers and some of their corners overlap each other, you could get shadows being cast from the shadow catcher onto another shadow catcher. So what I would suggest do is grab hold of the shadow catchers. I'm just going to select all the geometry and I'm going to type in cast shadow here and I'm going to turn it off. Now, in this particular case, it's a non-issue because there's nothing overlapping, but I've worked with a lot of stuff that has a lot of geometry and a lot of objects that will move past each other and things like that. You definitely want to have that option turned off. Now let's set up our post process for our shadow catching render. To do this, let's quickly go over to Visual Effects, add in a post process volume. And since I want to make sure that whatever we do in this volume affects the entire scene, we're going to type in infinite, and infinite extent unbound pops up here. Click on this, and that means that instead of everything happening only inside of this cube, it's going to happen to everything in the shot. The next thing we need to do is to add a post-process material that will create the shadow catching. And I got the solution from a tutorial that I watched by Render Bucket. I set up my post-process material a little differently, but I'll have a link to this tutorial in the notes so that you can watch it and understand a little more about how this works. I'm not going to sit and set all of this up. I'm just going to give you the material and then you can use it rather than having to explain it because there's a great tutorial that does. But you don't even need to watch the tutorial if you just want to use the setup that we've got. So if you select our post-process volume right here, I'm going to clear this out, type in material and you'll see that there's a post-process material section right here. Right now there's nothing in it, so we're going to click on plus and then we're going to set it to asset reference, and that means it's going to be using one of the assets that's already in the project. We'll go to the content browser, go over to the materials, and you'll see that there's a thing here called post-process materials, PP materials, and we can take this shadow catcher instance and we can just drag this onto here. And right now everything is just this bright white color. What I'm going to do is turn off our skylight. So I'm just going to type in visible. I'm going to make that invisible. And I'm also going to step out of the path tracer because that's why we can't see them. And what I can see is that we're getting these shadows here, but we're also getting the shadows on these objects in the background. So I'm just going to go over to my layers and I'm going to turn off all of the geometry that's in this 3D models layer. So we're just going to make it all invisible. Just make it invisible. And now if we play back, we can see the shadows. And it's looking good. Let's do just a little more organization just so we can set ourselves up for success. I'm going to go back to the outliner. I'm going to grab the post process right here, and I'm going to drag this into the layers. I'm going to put it right into the shadow catcher layer. And also I can just make the media plate invisible. Don't need that anymore. You can always turn it back on. And then let's not forget, go back to my outliner, just grab the camera, drop it in here so that we have a camera track. And we are good to render. So I'm going to hit the movie render queue button, and let's just do a couple of stuff here that we can get things looking the way we want. We're going to turn off JPEG sequence. Well, you could use one, but I'm going to go with the PNG sequence. And I'm also just going to add in some anti-aliasing to get those shadows as good as they can be. So come down here, add in anti-aliasing. I'll set this to 32 samples and turn on override anti-aliasing. And then I'm just going to go to output, and I'm going to give this name shadows and click accept, and then I'm going to hit render. Okay, with that done, now let's render out our 3D models. So I'm going to select the shadow catcher layer right here, and I'm going to select all of the geometry by clicking on that, and I'm going to type in visible, and I'm going to turn it off, the visibility for these layers. I'm also going to go over to the post process right here. Now there is no visibility switch for the post process. Instead, we have to go back to the material that we were working with before and twirl that down. And if we twirl this down further, we'll see that there's a value for the strength of the effect, and we're just going to set that to 0. Then we're going to go back to the 3D models, and we're going to select their geometry, and we're going to type in visible, and we'll make them visible. Oh, and we also need to bring back our skylight right here. So I'm just going to make that visible, and I think we're doing good here now. Now let's get this rendered out. So hop into the render settings right here, and we're going to make some changes here. We're going to go, instead of with a PNG sequence, we're going to go with EXR, right? Just like we did before. EXR sequence, we're going to want to add in the object IDs. And instead of deferred rendering, I'm going to render with path tracing. If you wanted to keep it deferred rendering, that's the standard video game renderer that's you're using in Unreal, that's fine. But I like the level of realism we're going to get out of this, and it is going to take a lot longer to render. But let's take a crack at this. So I'm going to go over to Path Tracer, which is down here at the bottom. So I can just type in path if you can't see it. And we see that there's this one here called Path Tracer. And then in anti-aliasing, I'm actually going to raise the sample count up quite a bit. Maybe try 128. And there have been times where if I was rendering a complete scene with path tracing, I've gone even up to 512. But this is probably good enough. And then I'm just going to set it off to render. And once that's done, we can head over to After Effects. I do wish that this process were a little simpler, that we didn't have to throw these switches, turning individual things on and off. And in fact, that may not be a requirement. I was talking over this whole process with Ryan Mayetta, the lead technical product manager in virtual production at Unreal. And he explained to me that there's a whole render graph system that makes it possible to create a flowchart that you can then render out different layers and different things. And if you're doing a lot of this, it's definitely a more efficient way to do things. However, it's outside the scope of this tutorial. For the kind of stuff that we're doing here, we can keep it simple. But if your project becomes a huge thing, this might be a better solution. Okay, so here I am back in After Effects. I'm going to take all of these layers that we have here. We don't need to use these for now. I'm going to make them invisible, and I'm also going to make them shy and then turn on the shy layer. So now we've just got our 3D camera, which we don't even really need here, but we've got our footage. And then I'm going to import the footage that we just rendered out. I'm going to navigate to the folder. First, I'll grab this EXR sequence. I'll click on Import. And then I'm going to grab the PNG sequence. It's down below here. It doesn't really matter. Grab any of these. And I'll import that as well. Now, something we need to do is reinterpret the footage, because by default, After Effects usually imports this footage at either 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second, and this is actually 60 frames per second. So I'm just going to change this to interpret footage, main, and I'm going to set this to 60, and then I'm going to do the same for this one right here and set it to 60. And I'm going to drop on first, let's drop the shadow on there, right? Bring that down. And once I've got the shadow layer in there, I could try something like switching it over to the darken mode, and that's okay, but it's not going to look the way I want it to. I can see that even if I make this less opaque, right, if I lower the opacity, it's never going to look quite like that. I want to get a better color match. So let me do this instead. I'm going to get rid of the darken, go back to normal, and I'm going to choose Layer, Pre-Compose, and I'm going to create a new composition. We're going to call it Shadows. And I'm going to move all attributes. I'm going to open the new composition, click OK. And then I'm going to create a new solid and make it the comp size, make it black, doesn't matter. Just move it under here. And I'm going to use this shadow layer as a matte for this black layer below it. So what I'll do is I'll set it from no matte to this bus track shadow layer. And then I'm going to tell it to not use it as an alpha matte. We're going to use it as a luma matte, and then I'm going to invert that. Okay, so now basically what I have is this layer that's got these shadows, and they have an alpha channel. And if I go back here, I can then affect this by setting this to be an adjustment layer. And now anything that we apply to this shadows layer will only happen on the footage below it in exactly the same spot as the shadows. So I'm going to choose Effect, Color Correction, and I'm going to go with Lumetri Color. And then I'm going to go into basic correction. I'm going to lower the exposure to -2. And then I'm going to head over to the color wheels. And I want to push the shadow just a little more into whatever this is, like a bluish kind of thing. So I'm going to just push it just a little bit. It may take a moment to get there. But yeah, that color's looking a lot better, right? If I come in here. Now I see that it's very sharp. I'm going to go back right here to the shadow layer. And I'm going to choose Effect, Blur and Sharpen, and Gaussian Blur. And I can set that to something like 4, and then come back here. And that's looking pretty good. So then let's add in our actual footage of the 3D models, right? So I'll grab this one, the objects. I'll drop this down on top. I'll choose Effect, 3D Channel, Cryptomatte, and then let's start with this right here. Let's just select this one, choose Colors, and we're going to do Matted RGBA. And I think we can blur this a little bit. Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Gaussian Blur, and maybe make this one 2. And then let's look at how we might be able to color correct this. So with this layer selected, I'll choose Effect, Color Correction, and we're going to go with Lumetri Color. And I'm going to go over to the color wheels, and let me see. If I want to push the shadows, it's a little tough one, but let me see. Push them a little up this way. A little tint, and then we'll do the highlights, maybe more into the oranges. It's a little much, but can also just bring up the brightness. Just kind of get this to look a little bit better. This is before Lumetri Color. This is a little more, so you see the shadows, kind of like these colors are matching now. And this is okay, and we could do this for every object and try to make this work, and that's not terrible, right? I mean, the edges are a little too sharp, and that's why I want to look at another solution. So jumping back, what I've got here is I've got shadows. There's no effect on it. It's just what it is. It is the pre-comp that's got the alpha channel, and I've got my 3D objects that has Cryptomatte and Gaussian Blur, but isn't using Lumetri Color or any of that. So we're going to take these, and we're also going to just get the Cryptomattes for the other layers quickly. So let me just duplicate that. And jumping ahead, because you already know how to do this, we'll move forward into the next part. And just to make it easier to work with, we'll rename the layers to make sense. Okay. With all these layers selected, except the 3D camera, right? So I've got my statues, my gate, my towers, my shadows, and the background. I'm going to choose Effect, RG, VFX, and Super Comp. Without overstating things, I think that Super Comp is the greatest thing to happen to compositing in After Effects. Unlike high-end compositing software, After Effects can't really see the layers behind it when you're using effects like light wrap or other things. This tool, Super Comp, makes it possible for the layers to interact with each other in a way that's really important for compositing to be believable. And it can pull colors from the layers behind it. So there's all sorts of advantages. If you're doing a lot of compositing in After Effects, I strongly recommend you get VFX Suite and especially Super Comp. So let's take a look here. I'm going to start with these background objects right here, these towers, and I'm going to add in some color correction first. Let's go with color correction, and there's a button right here that is match background. And the first thing that happens is it's going to be pulling in some of that blue, and that's a little too much. So instead, let me just undo that. I'm going to take hold of these towers, and I'm just going to move them a little further down here like this so that they're pulling from the ground. And now I'm going to hit match background, and that is looking much better. Let me hit P for position and reset that. If I want to make it a little bit lighter in the shadows, I can do that. I'm also going to do stuff like, let's add in a light wrap, right? So I'll go to light wrap, and I'm going to raise up the amount a bunch and the size so it really bleeds over. The light from the background will bleed over into it. And I'm also going to kind of work the edges a little bit. So we've got a couple of effects. There's edge blend. Let's do this one. And I can just make the radius a little higher. Just maybe something like 1.5. And you can see it erodes the edges without losing the sharpness of the image, which is what I want. And I can even try adding in something like an edge erode just a little bit, which kind of actually does erode it. Let me just try set that to 3. It's very small and very subtle. And then there's one last thing, which is a reverse light wrap, which takes what we have on this object and sort of bleeds it into the background a little bit. So I'm going to raise up the size a bunch and raise up the amount. And it's a subtle effects. You can see it there. If I turn it on, turn it off. But now, as we move this to the side for a moment, we can take a look and we can see that feels like it's a lot more in there because of those edges and the blur and light wrap and whatnot. And now I want to do it for the rest of the stuff too. So I'm going to bring Super Comp back in, and I'm going to dock it alongside the comp window. And then I'm going to right click on the towers here and choose copy all effects. And I'm going to drop it on the statues. And I'll hit paste. And we get everything, and it's not quite the color that I want. So I'm going to go over to the color matching. I'm also going to select the statues. I'm going to move them down. I'm going to tell it to grab the color from the ground. And if I do that, watch what happens. They turn very dark. And the reason is because these shadows are there. Like I said, these layers are aware of each other. So I'm going to remove the shadows, and then I'm going to try this one more time. And that's looking pretty good. I might want to make it just slightly darker. And then I'm just going to reset the position. And then I'm going to bring the shadows back. And then let's do the same thing for the gate. Let's just come closer to the bus again, back where we were. And I'm going to right click and choose paste effects. And then again for the color matching. And that's looking pretty good. So now let's do the shadows. So I'll select them. I'm going to move to a place where we can really see them. Right here is a great place. And we're going to set this layer to be an adjustment layer, very similarly to what we did before. And if I click on this plus button, this time now you see the effects are limited to ones that make sense for an adjustment layer. So I'm going to choose color correction. I'm going to come down over here. I'm going to set the exposure to -2. And let's move down to where we can actually see these shadows even better. Yeah, and that's looking good. Let's also just try playing subtly with the color. And I think that we're good now. So let's just take a look here. And I want to point out that I did make a small mistake here, which is you can see this shadow right here. It's going to collide with this chair at some point. I would probably just redo this and move this out a little bit further so the shadow doesn't hit it. Or I could roto this out if I wanted to, but I'd rather not. But overall, you can see it's looking pretty good. And finally, what I need to do is to add some color grading on top. So I'll choose Layer, New, Adjustment Layer, get this on top of Super Comp, and I'll choose Effect, Red Giant Magic Bullet, and Looks. That's the tool that I generally use. And then let's just use some of the tools I like to use. I've shown in other tutorials. I'm going to drop in chromatic aberration. I'll set this to 0.3 and negative 0.3, which creates a little bit of lens aberration at the edges. I'm going to add in a vignette over here just to darken the edges a little bit. I'll grab Colorista and shift some of the color a little bit anyway. We'll just kind of get the greens and the teals, just kind of bring these together a little bit and move these towards that like this. And then I'm just going to add in some film noise, which helps bring it all together. So we'll drop in Renoiser, and I'll pick something like 35 millimeter and go with that. Click OK to confirm. And one more thing, Effect, RG Universe Stylize, and choose Universe Finisher. I like Finisher because it gives a bit more contrast, although I want to probably bring out the saturation maybe just a little bit. So let's see if we can drop it down just a tiny bit. I think it's looking really good. And one last thing that we can look at is just having the shadows deform based on the terrain. So I can select my shadow layer right here, and I can choose Effect, Distort, and we can go with Displacement Map. And for the displacement map, we can choose the bus footage right here. And I might crank this up to 10 to 10. And instead of setting red, we're going to go with luminance for both of these. And let's see if we can see the shadows a little better. Let's look over here. Okay, so you can see the shadows, how they're bending here now. If I turn this off, it's straight. So now we're getting shadows that are, bending to the environment the way real shadows would. Now let's preview the whole thing. All in all, I think that this is a really solid result. And yeah, there's a little bit of slippage on those pillars in the background. And that's not because of any kind of data loss between After Effects and Unreal. It's just because I never had the tracking data for those points all the way in the back to begin with. But you can see that the objects in the foreground are sticking really solidly because we had those tracking markers, we had those solids that we put into the scene to help us find our spaces for these objects. Side note, adding spaceships makes everything better, and you should do it whenever possible. And if we come back into After Effects and we take a look, so let me just turn off Super Comp here and turn off the adjustment layer for Magic Bullet. And then I'm going to unhide, let me just quickly unhide the shy layers so that I can work with these 3D solids and show you, we were only able to get data that was like up to there, and these towers are much further back. So yeah, we ended up with some slippage. But hey, if there's anything I've learned when it comes to making VFX magic with a school bus,
it's time to take chances, make mistakes, and get messy.
Yeah, sorry, not sorry. Now, if I undo that, just to hide this stuff again, it's really cool when you see the difference in look, like before Super Comp and after Super Comp. I mean, that is really nice. Then add the color grading on top of it, and that looks really solid. And if you're not ready to go all in on the Red Giant VFX suite, AEscripts.com has some alternatives like Easy Comp, which uses AI to match the color of your elements to the rest of your shot, and Comp Buddy, which simplifies the process of light wraps and edge blurs. I haven't used these tools, but they look promising. I'll leave links below. And sure, this isn't a perfect process, and there's definitely some hiccups along the way, but I'm finding that with the right amount of work, I'm getting some really good results, and I can't wait to see what you guys do with it. Hey, thanks for sticking with me on this long journey. Hopefully you now have what you need to let After Effects and Unreal work together in perfect harmony. Namaste. Once again, I'm Aharon Rabinowitz for School of Motion. I'll see you in the next one.